Escalation clause, a real estate term you should know. When purchasing a home, it's important to know what you're getting into. One such important clause is the escalation clause. Escalation clauses are often used to protect the buyer and seller from unforeseen changes, but they can also be used to benefit one party over the other depending on the situation. If you're looking to buy a house and want to know more about escalations clauses, keep watching. What is an escalation clause? Escalation clauses are a provision in a contract that defines an increase in the purchase price for one or both parties based on the cost of inflation. Generally, this is at a predetermined rate or indexed to the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which is an indicator of inflation. The escalation clause's goal is to protect the buyer and seller from unforeseen changes. If your homebuyer has an escalation clause in their contract, they will be protected from any unexpected rise in housing prices. This way, if the market value of houses goes up significantly without warning, they won't be left with a huge mortgage that they can't afford. In addition to protecting buyers and sellers from unforeseen changes, escalation clauses can be used to benefit one party over the other depending on the situation. For instance, if you're trying to sell your home now, but think it's worth more than what buyers are currently willing to pay, you could use an escalation clause as an incentive for buyers. You could offer them an increased purchase price based on your prediction that housing prices will rise over time. The best part? If you're right about future housing prices increasing, you'll profit. Why do we need an escalation clause? Escalation clauses are often used to protect the buyer and seller from unforeseen changes. For example, if you had a clause that was indexed to CPI, then the purchase price would be increased based on an increase in inflation. If there were no escalation clause, then your home would become worth less than what you paid for it over time. This is because an inflationary index would increase quicker than the agreed-upon purchase price. An escalation clause might also be used to benefit one party over the other depending on the situation. For example, if there's an escalation clause in your contract where the cost of living goes up by 5% every year, but your mortgage interest rate remains constant, then you will save money in the long run due to paying less in interest month. If you're interested in buying a house and want to understand more about escalations clauses, this video is for you. How do we calculate the escalation rate? Before we get into the different ways to calculate the escalation rate, let's take a minute to define it. Escalation is a term used in contracts that defines an increase in the purchase price for one or both parties based on the cost of inflation. The escalation clause is typically actionable for predetermined periods, such as annually or quarterly. Unfortunately, there isn't a universal formula for calculating escalation rates because so much depends on the specific agreement between the parties involved in the contract. In general, when faced with a complicated situation, you should consult your attorney to figure out how the escalation clause will work. For example, if you have an escalation clause with a predetermined rate and CPI indexing, you're going to need legal advice to understand how these two clauses will interact with each other. If it's not already clear from this definition, there are two types of escalations. Annual escalation clause. This type of clause is typically used in commercial leases. The annual escalation percentage is usually tied to CPI increases and can be adjusted at any time by either party. Do we always use escalations clauses when purchasing a home? Escalation clauses are often used to protect the buyer and seller from unforeseen changes. Conclusion: an escalation clause is a clause in a real estate contract that allows the seller to increase the price of the property over time. This is a fairly common clause in purchase agreements, but not all agreements will include one. It is helpful for buyers because it gives them some protection from large price increases. We recommend that you include an escalation clause on your real estate purchase agreement if you foresee an increase in inflation, or if you think the seller may want to increase the sale price over time.